Welcome to this week's Resistance TV broadcast. Tonight we're discussing animal rights in the modern world with acclaimed actor and animal rights campaigner Peter Egan, animal rights trailblazer Ronnie Lee, and Hunt Saboteurs Association spokesperson Steve Milton. There's no doubt that support for animal rights has grown exponentially over the past few decades, yet animal abuse still continues in farming, in research, and in so-called sport. Even though hunting with dogs was banned in 2005, wildlife is still being persecuted in the British countryside. And before we begin tonight's discussion, I just want to play a clip of a conversation between senior hunt supporters who seem to think they're above the law.
Anything that comes out of these meetings is to be kept amongst ourselves. Isn't that marvellous that they haven't seen us because we've just caught a fox behind them? I mean, you've got to be very careful about who's saying what.
It's a lot easier to create a smoke screen if you've got more than one trail there operating. And that is what it's all about, trying to portray to the people watching that you're going about your legitimate business.
Oh, sorry, I've got one more thing. The police interviews and inquiries. By the police. I hope there are no police officers listening. There is no such thing as an off-the-record chat with a policeman.
You can't just pay stewards and think you can carry on and go hunting. And they will solve your problem.
So something for your hunt staff and terrier men, trail layers, everybody to consider. If you're recording evidence for a hunting act, trail laying, whatever, don't use the same phones or anything where you've been using the social media and bragging about what you've been doing out hunting. Because if the police get hold of it, you'll get both sides of it.
Bird of prey, the law states you can use a pack of dogs to flush a wild mammal to be hunted by a bird of prey. Now, that's a terribly good wheeze for holding up, and I think that everyone during autumn hunting ought to be considering that.
Now, you know more about hunting than saboteurs or the courts will know. But what it will do is create that smoke screen or that element of doubt that we haven't deliberately hunted a fox.
Terrier work. This is our soft underbelly. A lot of people would say that if you're going trail hunting, why do you need terrier men following you around?
That looks like a conspiracy to conspiracy to commit break the law. I don't know what you think, Peter, but why do you think that hunting still persists to this day, Peter, given that it was banned in 2005?
Well, firstly, as one can see from this webinar, it has such great support in very high places. Obviously, the police aren't doing their job correctly, and we see two retired police officers advising this webinar hosted by Lord Mancroft, who speaks on behalf of hunting in the House of Lords. Also, there are so many holes in the Hunting Act itself, which allows it to be abused in the way it has been abused over the last 15 years. But what I find most disturbing about watching what I have watched of this webinar, I've watched certainly 19 minutes of it, and I know that the participants are saying, oh, well, everything is taken out of context. You're just using little bits and pieces without seeing the whole thing. Well, I've seen half the thing, and it seems to me to be absolutely clear that Lord Mancroft is hosting a webinar that is advising hunters how to deceive the police, the public, and get away with their horrible obsession, their hobby, which is so depraved and destructive, which is killing poor innocent wildlife and particularly foxes. But what I found incredibly upsetting when I watched it was to see this group of course, incredibly well-placed people talking in such a civil manner about something as disgusting as fox hunting, treating it as if it were like discussing a game of billiards or, you know, any other harmful pastime. They're actually talking quite civilly and objectively about how they can pursue, hunt, and destroy an innocent animal. And when we consider that, depending on which poll you read, that between 80 and 90% of the UK are opposed to this disgusting pastime, I find it totally shocking.
Do you think that there is a fault in the way the legislation was drafted, though, Peter? I mean, at the end of the day, hunting is banned by law in theory, and yet we have what looked to me like a criminal conspiracy there to get around it. I wonder whether, you know, we should be arguing, should we, for tightening up of the loopholes that they're seeking?
Absolutely, without question. I think that there should be a tightening up of the loopholes. All of these little pulse access points that they can touch on, they've all got to be shut down, and so that they can't be abused in the way that they are. And also, I think that the local police have got to stand up and do their duty and not pretend that they can't see what's going on.
Yeah, let me just bring in Ronnie now, if I may. I mean, Ronnie, you were fabbing hunts back in the 1970s. You were one of the trailblazers, as I introduced you, as an animal rights trailblazer. You were kind of getting involved, you know, well before many other people who subsequently, you know, joined the fray. And I think I remember when I joined the Saboteurs Association in 1977, I think it was, I was inspired by seeing you and other activists from the Hunt Saboteurs Association disrupting the Waterloo Cup. But I was just going to say, which is which was a premier hare coursing event for those who are not familiar with that. But I just wonder what your thoughts were, Ronnie. I mean, you've got the benefits of the long view in a sense. Do you think that the Hunting Act has made any difference at all to the persecution of wildlife in the countryside?
It's made some difference. I mean, you referred to the Waterloo Cup, which is a big organised coursing event. But the one big success of the Hunting Act, probably the only success of it in a way, is that those big organised coursing events can no longer take place because they blatantly against the law, and so it has.
Ronnie, could you come a bit closer to your microphone? We're not picking you up very well. Sorry.
Is that better if I'm a bit nearer like that?
Yeah, a bit better, mate. Yeah.
See my face rather large.
We get a full detail of your features there, but don't worry. But we want to hear what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. The one big success of the Hunting Act is to put an end to the big organised coursing events like the Waterloo Cup and a number of other big events like that happen throughout the country. That was the one real success is to do that. But of course, the rough coursing where guys just go out in the field with some greyhounds or lurchers and go after hares, for instance, that still carries on. And the Hunting Act was nowhere near strong enough. The problem with the Act was that it actually allowed hunting to continue. We should have had a law that actually forced the hunts to disband, where they had to disband, close their kennels, and get rid of the whole show. Because what's happened is the Hunting Act has allowed the infrastructure of hunting to continue. So they are still hunting. This trail hunting is just a smokescreen. And even if trail hunting is done as it's supposed to be done, it still poses a danger to wildlife, because if while they're on the trail, the hounds come across the scent of a fox, or even if they come across the scent of a deer, for instance, they will go and chase after that animal. So trail hunting still poses a risk to wildlife. And the other thing about hunting is, of course, is they kill a very large number of their own dogs, and that's still carrying on with trail hunting. There was one report that suggested that 5,000 of the hounds are killed by hunts every year when they're either too old to hunt or they're not suitable to hunt in a pack, even as young dogs. So there's that whole aspect of it, which is absolutely disgusting. And so really, the only way of protecting wildlife from hunting is to have a situation where hunts are forced to totally disband, to close their kennels, to get rid of the whole show. And that is really what the Hunting Act should have done, instead of allowing this fudge of trail hunting which is easily abused and which leads to the death of wild animals anyway.
I think there's been a number of hunts that have disbanded since the Hunting Act came into law, and I think that is in some measure because hunts have been, to a large degree, driven underground. They're not as open as they used to be in terms of advertising where they meet, and so I suspect that they've not got the level of subscription perhaps that they once had. So I guess in that sense, it's probably made some contribution. Do you think, Ronnie?
I think possibly in that way it has. It may be that there are fewer wild animals being killed by hunts, but one fox killed by a hunt or one hare killed by a hunt is one too many. And this is a disgusting activity, and it kind of shows how we need a different type of government, because there's huge public opinion opposed to hunting and indeed many other blood sports, and that public opinion has been opposed to these activities for decades, and yet it's only fairly recently that we've had this kind of half-hearted ban on hunting, and that's still, hunting still continuing, despite the wishes of the vast majority of the public. So it really shows that public opinion itself doesn't really count for very much unless you've got a government in power that is prepared to listen to what people want. And so, the Tories are flown in the face of public opinion, because the other thing that's happening, of course, is because it's not just to do with the strength of legislation, it's to do with enforcement. And what's happening is this, the already weak law against hunting is not being enforced. And the reason it's not being enforced is because, quite honestly, I think the instructions have come from the government to the police forces to not put emphasis on enforcing hunting. So once again, a different sort of government would mean, first of all, that we could have strong laws to get rid of hunting, and secondly, that those laws would be strongly enforced. And so that's what we need to work towards.
I think it certainly does point up the crisis of representative democracy. You're right, in my opinion. I mean, I've been quite critical of the way in which people who are supposed to be our representatives, I mean, and I was in the House of Commons myself, but they don't seem to represent the interests of or the wishes of, in many circumstances, and this is a case in point, of the vast majority of the public. It seems that people are able to obtain influence through lobbying and through their position in society. But let me bring in Steve now, if I can. But before I just bring Steve in, I want to just play another clip which kind of illustrates the sense of entitlement of the hunting fraternity, and it just shows you as well the sort of provocation that the hunt sabs, the hunt monitors, have to put up with on a daily basis when they're monitoring hunts to make sure they are complying with the law after all. So if we could just play that clip now, please.
Get off this land, you horrible, common, filthy scum! You're just thieving, pikey f***ers! Get off this land! Imagine if I came into your garden in your common little council house and started shitting and pissing everywhere and leaving rubbish. Imagine that! You've got no respect, you filthy, dirty peasant.
Blimey, Steve, you're a filthy, dirty peasant then, according to that guy. I mean, how do you keep your cool under such provocation? And is that typical of the sort of reaction that you get from the hunting fraternity?
Yeah, it's fairly typical, or even though that was fairly tame compared to a lot of stuff we've had. I mean, some of the insults you really can't reproduce. Certainly not in the public domain. They come homophobic, racist, misogynistic, everything. But it's quite funny you should say, how do you keep your cool? Because it's one of the biggest comments that we get from our supporters. A lot of them will say, oh, I'd love to come out, but I could never keep my cool and I would end up getting nicked. But it's very easy. So, we're not there ultimately to get into arguments with people that have a massive hatred. You know, they hate you with a passion because you're stopping what they like doing, which is killing for fun. So we're not there to get into arguments with them, and it's an easy trap to fall into, but we're there to keep our cool and get on with the job. You know, if we're stood there arguing with people, we're not stopping them from hunting. So, but on the plus side, if they're getting really, really wound up, you know you're doing a good job. So it kind of spurs us on in that respect.
I mean, as you probably know, Steve, I was a member like Ronnie of the Hunt Saboteurs Association in the 1970s, and we were certainly subject to a fair amount of violence then. But I've heard anecdotally from people who are still active like yourself, and although I've not witnessed it, so this is anecdotally I'm speaking now, but in many ways it seems that the level of violence has substantially intensified. And I wonder whether that's because obviously with this modern technology, we've now got the ability to film people on our smartphones and so on. And clearly with the Hunting Act now being on the statute book for all its faults, it does actually put them on the wrong side of the law. So, I mean, perhaps you could just say a little bit about the level. I mean, you've just touched on it there. And what type of violence have you been subjected to? I mean,
most of the time, the large percentage will be verbal abuse, but you will get, especially if you're especially effective, quite often things will escalate, especially if you've just seen a fox to safety. So, you know, they could have been on a scent, and you know you've got on the horn and you've taken the hounds away from that, and they will get really aggravated over that. So you could get anything from being ridden down by horses. That's a favourite of the riders. I was ridden down last year and ended up in hospital. So that's one of their biggest ones. They'll actually ride at you. I mean, it's like getting hit by a car when you know, that's potentially, you know, they're trying to kill you if you get ridden over by a significantly sized, you know, hunt horse, right down to their own. They'll quite often bring in their own, what they call stewards, but realistically, they're just local thugs that they'll give some beer money to come and beat you up, basically. So there's some fairly significant violence that's involved. Anything from just, you know, being rugby tackled and getting knelt on into mud to properly getting a good kick in, as they would say. But as you alluded to there, I think the reason we're seeing so much more of this now is because social media and everybody's access to actually good quality video recording equipment, which is small and it's convenient. You know, most SABs are wearing body cams now. They do that primarily for their own defense. Should anything go to court and you can identify that someone that's, you know, committed an assault against you, then potentially, you know, your body cams will have that evidence, which again, it's one of those other things in the fact that if you're wearing those body cams, that's the first thing they actually go for. You always know if you're in trouble if they're grabbing you and grabbing your body cam, because if they get it, you know what's coming next.
It's reckless behavior. There's no doubt about that, to ride people down. I mean, you know, the famous suffragette, Emily Wilding Davison, of course, when she was making her protest at the Derby, I mean, was killed when she was trying to pin the suffragette colours onto the King's horse. So it's incredibly reckless behaviour that they're engaging in. And what's been the reaction of the police on that, but also in terms of actually enforcing the Hunting Act? I mean, are they doing a decent enough job, do you think, the police, in trying to make sure that the hunts keep within the law?
Well, there's a very simple overall question to that, and it's no. They're falling well short at the moment. Having said that, I think it varies hugely around the country, depending where you are. Some areas are diabolical. It's absolutely no point in even engaging with the local force because they're blatantly corrupt. You know, you will have officers there that will be policing hunts whose partners are riding with the hunt. You'll actually have serving officers that are, you know, members of the local hunt. It's been well publicised, a lot of these, and yet some forces, you know, are actually trying to do something. I mean, I'm fairly lucky in the fact that where I live, our local force seems, even though they're very, very short of resources, they seem to be one of the better ones and actually seem to want to, uphold the Hunting Act for what it's worth, because obviously it's very difficult due to the number of loopholes that are in it.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are, Peter, about the way in which the police don't seem to be enforcing the law properly. They don't seem to be providing protection to lawful activity, really, by hunt saboteurs and monitors actually observing what the hunt is doing. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think it's absolutely a dereliction of duty as far as the police are concerned. But what is interesting is I'm sort of a latecomer to this table of animal rights, and as we know from our relationship with a certain charity, for which I was a vice VP for about 6 or 7 years, it was from that point on that I began to really understand the great work that hunt sabs do and the great work that animal rights protesters do, because of the media and because of the way that hunt sabs are presented, being balaclaved, and they are referred to as the aggressors in a situation where in fact they are the pacifiers. They are the people who get between the horrible and devastating sick aggression of the hunters and the poor prey. They stand in between that. They are the pacifiers. And most of them that I have met, and I've met quite a lot in my travels throughout the country and speaking at certain events, all of them that I have met are incredibly human, incredibly gentle, strong people, of course, because they have to be, but incredibly moderate in their thinking. And when I come up against the hunters, they are incredibly aggressive. I think it's shocking in the modern world to see a twerp like that guy in the field refer to a hunt sab as "go back to your council house," or this incredibly provocative language that comes from these, I hate using terms like upper and lower class, but these upper class, whatever they are, twerps. I mean, it is absolutely shocking. So, and they are so confident because, yes, these people in these positions do have the local police as their friends who come to their tea parties and their garden parties and represent the local constabulary. And they are all, it seems to me, except in certain circumstances, they are all part of the game. I mean, they are not offended as we are by the disgusting choice that these people on a horse with their stirrup cups and their red jackets, what we will call the aristocrats of the hunting community, who feel that they can lord it over everyone, and somehow they have managed to either by payrolling or by some quasi sort of position, they encourage the terrier men to doff their caps and look up to the Lord and want to please them. But they both have one thing in common, and that is they are emotionally psychopathic. And what I find disgusting is that we have a force called the police force who are supposed to protect us from psychopaths, in fact, help them out. It's absolutely shocking. But I think what is wonderful about social media is that we are able to see hunt sabs as the human beings that they are, and the amazingly committed people who work in animal rights as the human beings they are. And in general, if people take the trouble, they soon learn who the aggressors are.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly I think you're absolutely right. And that was my experience, that sort of lackey mentality of the sort of hunt followers, the so-called terrier men, the people that have the terriers in the Land Rovers to flush foxes when they go to ground. Curious that they still have, when they're supposed to be just trail hunting, and they use fox scent to follow that trail. So they accidentally, on purpose, then if they come across a fox, chase that, and oh, it was a mistake. We were trail hunting. But why do they need terriers? Why do they go cub hunting? I mean, this is the seasons are the seasons are exactly the same as they were when they were chasing a live quarry, aren't they, Peter?
Absolutely. It's a total con. I mean, I have spoken to people who are committed drag hunters, and they are deeply offended that their hobby, which is basically quite humane, for want of a better word, they are offended by the fact that they are associated with the blood sports.
No, absolutely. I want to change tack a little bit in a moment. I want to go to Ronnie, but I just wondered if just finally, Peter, I mean, obviously you work in the arts and so on, and I guess you kind of rub shoulders with people in the media. It's so curious, isn't it, that I know the media do give this some attention, but the sort of thing that we've seen today or this evening, with that guy shouting those abusive remarks, the sort of violence that and abuse that Steve has outlined, it rarely gets covered in the media. And yes, yet it's commonplace. Why do you think that is? Why isn't the media actually doing its job properly and actually reporting what's actually happening in the hunting field right now?
Well, I think that happens. It's happening more and more now, and it happens more and more because social media actually gets the news out anyway, and conventional terrestrial media is being left behind. But I think it happens because there's a corporate interest in all of these outlets that they want to protect the big business element that is paying for their advertising space and actually paying their wages. So we see it, in what's happening in America, in the election, this recent election. Vested interests have tried to control something that they couldn't control. So I think it's to do with that. I think it's also to do with the fact that these corporations, for a better word, wish to represent people who are against cruelty as villains rather than compassionate human beings. And that's also to do with the fact that our society is based upon people regarding animals as commodities, things that they can do what they will with, ownership. If you can eat an animal, you can kill an animal. If you can kill an animal, you can wear its clothes. You can do whatever you like because an animal doesn't have rights. We all know that that's absolute rubbish. And my life has changed phenomenally in the last 20 years because of my fundamental belief that animals have the same rights that we have. And I believe, as we all do, I hope, that you can't have human welfare without human rights. You can't have animal welfare without animal rights. And these are things that big corporations protecting their income fight against all the time. So they are going to represent people who care as the enemy.
Well, thanks, Peter, for that, because that neatly enables me to sort of segue into the next part of the conversation this evening. And I wanted to just go to Ronnie. Hopefully your microphone's working a bit better, Ronnie. We were struggling to hear you.
I'll try and, I don't know whether I can be heard any better now.
Yeah, no, it's a little bit better. It is a bit better now, mate. But what did you just want to...
Sorry, I'm a lot
wanted to ask you, though, Ronnie. Livestock, it poses an existential threat to the human race, to the planet, because of its connection to the climate change, potential climate catastrophe. I wonder what your thoughts were. I know you're active in the Green Party. How can we get that message across? Because it's a kind of a taboo, really. I mean, there's a lot of people who are concerned about the environment, but don't necessarily make that connection between the livestock industry and the impact on the climate. And I just wondered what your thoughts were in relation to that, in terms of how we get that message over to people, because politicians fight shy about talking about what people put on their plate to eat, don't they?
Yes, I mean, that's a big problem. I mean, it's kind of like the elephant in the room, really, in terms of the climate crisis. But it's such a huge contribution to that crisis, the fact that people consume animal products and that we have animal farming because of that, and all the emissions that are created by that. But also another huge problem for the environment is industrialized fishing in a different way through the destruction it causes to the oceans. And so really that the most important thing, there was a study by scientists at Oxford University a couple of years ago, and they came to the conclusion that the most important thing any individual person could do to protect the planet was to go vegan. And obviously we need actions from government, we need actions to do with emissions from industry, for instance, emissions from transport. Governments have a huge role to play in combating those. But something that every ordinary person can do, and which would make a huge difference, would be to adopt a vegan diet. And that is something that it's kind of so often ignored. I read articles in the newspapers about measures being taken and being proposed by the government and all the bodies to combat the climate crisis. No mention is made of diet. No mention is made of encouraging people to adopt a vegan diet. No mention is made of encouraging farmers to switch over to growing vegetable crops and indeed planting woodland, which is really, really important, instead of doing animal farming. And this is it is a huge problem, and it's something that's ignored. But I think it's something that activists can do something about. We need to be all getting active to educate, go out there and educate people about the importance of veganism, not just in terms of the climate, but in terms of the animals that are actually directly slaughtered because humans consume animal products. It's 50,000 animals a second worldwide killed to feed the human species, and this is totally unnecessary because we could all live on a vegan diet. And that's kind of something that's ignored because, in a sense, the whole thing is still sort of human-centered. Because when people talk about eating purely plant-based, that's usually the term they use in order to combat the climate crisis. That's still, although that's obviously going to help animals in a lot of ways, it's still done from a human-centric point of view. It said, well, look, the climate crisis is going to cause catastrophe for human beings, and one of the ways of stopping that catastrophe is to end or reduce our consumption of animal products. The main reason to actually end the consumption of animal products is for the sake of the animals. First of all, for the sake of the animals that are directly slaughtered to provide those products, and also for the sake of the animals that are going to suffer and die because of the climate crisis. And the climate crisis impacts far more on wildlife than it does on humans. Millions of wild animals are dying as we speak because of the effects of global heating. Now that's happening now. It is already affecting humans to some extent, but it's been affecting wildlife for a long time, and it's kind of
yes. I mean, David Attenborough recently published. We're still really struggling to with your audio, Ronnie. So we're not actually hearing it very clearly what you're saying. But I think I got the general gist of what you were saying. It was interesting that David Attenborough produced a documentary recently. Even he was talking about or encouraging people to consider a plant-based diet, which I think was a huge and a significant step. I wonder, Peter, you're a vegan. I mean, are you optimistic that people are beginning to make that connection between the environment and their diet? And also Ronnie's point, I think Ronnie said it was the statistic 50,000 animals a second are slaughtered for food. I mean, that's an astonishingly horrific statistic, isn't it?
It's horrible, yes. I mean, if you think in excess of 70 billion animals a year are slaughtered to feed 6.5 billion carnivores, I mean, it's just unbelievable. And that doesn't touch how many fish are killed per year. I think that the vegan movement has grown exponentially in the last 5 years due to great imperatives like Veganuary and and Veg Fest and things like that. I am very much optimistic when I visit these festivals and I see so many young people creating such fantastic food and such fantastic vegan product. But then when I read that there are only something like 17 to 18 million vegans throughout the world, then I don't feel quite as optimistic as I should. But I think there is no question that there is going to be a sea change in the next 20 years. And I think there will be a huge, as is happening now, a huge movement towards plant-based. Also because, again, the corporations have discovered that they have repeat customers with vegans, because vegans in the big supermarkets, and you see them now, there is a plant-based or vegan section in most big supermarkets. And vegans go back to that section and they keep buying. A lot of meat eaters are flexitarians and they shift between various things that they're eating. So I am a little optimistic. I've now reached an age which is far greater than all of you here, I think. So I don't think I'll see the major change in my lifetime, but I certainly hope that my daughter or my grandson will experience the shade from the trees whose seed I'm planting.
Yeah, no, thanks, Peter. And of course, following a vegan diet, I mean, apart from avoiding cruelty, it's also a more healthy option as well.
It's not just healthy, it's incredibly delicious. I mean, the variety is just sensational. I gave up eating meat, and I had been a meat eater for most of my life, but I gave up eating meat over 10 years ago, purely as a result of watching that amazing documentary Earthlings. And I decided I couldn't speak for 3 hours after watching it. And I decided then and there that I would never, ever eat meat again, and I haven't. I felt so much better. My digestion is better. I feel physically better. But most importantly, I feel better in whatever we consider our soul to be. I feel better in my soul. And my head is connected to my heart without any kind of obstruction. And I just think it is the most exciting, interesting, and delicious diet on the planet.
I was watching an interesting documentary, I think it was last year. It was one of those celebrity doctors, and they were looking at what's the secret of longevity, of a long life. And I remember during the course of the program, he was interviewing a chap who was 100 years old, and he was a heart surgeon. He'd retired at 96. And he said, goodness me, he said, what's your secret then? He said, well, he said, I went vegan 50 years ago. And he said, well, blimey, he said, you could still do it. He said, yeah, of course I could. He said, what made you retire? He said, well, you know, I thought at 96, I'd like to spend a bit of time with my family. He said his secret, the conclusion of this documentary was, because he wasn't just talking about diet, talking about a range of different things, but the secret to a long and healthy life was apparently dancing and a vegan diet. So, Peter, you're in the right occupation, being in the arts, as it were. So, you know,
don't do so much
have you with us for a lot longer.
Well, I don't dance very well, but I certainly do indulge very much in this in a great diet. In fact, when I became vegan, I announced it through Veganuary. I was sort of vegan before then anyway, but I got lots of letters, and at least 3 or 4 of them were from nurses who worked in hospices. And they all said, we're so pleased that you have decided to become a vegan. Peter, we like you as an actor and want to see more of you. But we've worked in hospices all of our lives, and we've never treated any vegans. So I thought that's a pretty good recommendation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Steve, I mean, the Hunt Sabs, as far as I know, is not a kind of a vegan organization, sort of animal rights organization. I think its motto used to be the St. Francis of Assisi quote, where it said, not to hurt our humble brethren is our first duty to them, but to stop there is not enough. We have a higher mission to be of service to them whenever they require it, which obviously is what kind of drives what the Hunt Sabs do. But I noticed, I was reading something, somebody sent me a cutting, and just really touching on the connection between this COVID crisis, which is why we're speaking over Zoom today, and the livestock industry. And this cutting was actually about mink farming. And apparently there'd been a cluster in, I think it was Denmark, a cluster of a COVID outbreak around this kind of mink farming concern. And the basis of the article was that COVID is likely to, or potentially anyway, put paid to the mink farming industry for fur coats. So that's another horrendously cruel practice. But I mean, where's the hunt sabs coming from in relation to this whole debate that we've just been talking about veganism and the kind of implications between diet and the climate impact on the climate and the environment?
Well, we always have. There's a saying amongst hunt sabs is you'll never see a fat sab, and that is primarily because I can't say for all of them, but we are primarily a vegan organisation, because it means that makes absolutely no sense to go out and save one animal and then go home and eat another one. There's just no basis in logic there. We always say to our members that you don't have to be a vegan to join, because we usually find that those that aren't vegans, then they come out and they find out what we're about, and our deeper ethos behind everything is the fact that over a period of time, we actually convert them into veganism. And the vast majority of sabs that come out that weren't vegans actually, stay as sabs, and then they become vegans, and then they become committed vegans. And obviously everybody knows, and to echo what Peter said, I think everyone's aware now of the damage that is being done to the planet through this industrialized farming of animals that are basically just commodities. I think that's the big issue is they're commodities. They're not seen as sentient beings. I think don't think there's a sab out there that doesn't think in that way. They're all committed not only to saving wildlife, but obviously saving the planet, because if there's no planet, there's no wildlife for us to save. So, we see the bigger picture. We're not just single focused. And also, we're all committed vegans as general, and we managed to convert a few that weren't in the first place. So it's a positive thing for us. Obviously, the amount of veganism that's been publicized now, and you get some quite good people that speak online about it. I think there's a big difference in how you approach people on you use term conversion, but I don't want to make it into almost like a religious sense. It's getting people to understand where their food comes from, the implications that it has, not just on them, but on the planet. And it helps when you get, obviously, people like Peter, who's got a huge following, but not only him, people like even Lewis Hamilton will come out and say something, huge following for people like that. And if he's coming out and saying, hey, look, I'm a lot fitter, even if it's not for the animals or even for the planet, do it for yourself, because it's better for you. I don't think there's any kind of scientist that's going to disagree with that fact. Like you said, when you're a sab, the amount of old sabs you see that are still running around the countryside, when those that probably the equivalents that would be eating meat are sat there with heart disease, then it speaks for itself as far as I'm concerned.
Ronnie, just before I bring Sean in, and bear in mind we've got problems with your audio, so perhaps just a kind of a brief response. Would you argue that there is a connection between human rights and animal rights?
Yes, I think that if you're going to argue against speciesism, it doesn't make sense if you're not also opposed to racism and sexism and all the prejudices that exist between humans. Because if you're not opposed to those things and you don't argue against those things, you haven't got a basis for arguing against speciesism. So definitely from that point of view, there is a really strong connection.
No, indeed. And I think there's been some research, I don't know if you've seen it, that suggests there's a connection between those who are cruel to animals and a connection between that and an abuse of people. I mean, could you just say a little bit about that, and then I'll bring Sean in to get reaction from our viewers this evening. No, you, Peter, yeah.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I work with a guy called Mal Plant, who is a professor at Newcastle University, and he's been working on a thing called the link for the last 20 years. The link basically is that children who are exposed to violence, as they are tremendously in Eastern Europe, across Eastern Europe, in terms of the stray dog population that are treated so appallingly by people in villages and cities. The children who witness this cruelty then witness domestic cruelty in their own home. It has become a proven link that those that are cruel to animals are cruel to humans, and many mass murderers start their trade by practicing on animals first and then move on to humans afterwards, once they've learned a few tricks in terms of how to destroy a living being. And the link is now being picked up by UNICEF and the United Nations, and it's also being developed in various bureaus in the FBI, because they are seeing the link between violence towards animals progressing to violence towards humans. And then, of course, it makes total sense, because we all know as we get older, if we look back, as one tends to as you age, and reflect on your past, that a lot of what you are is built into you up to the age of 7, as the Jesuits used to say, give me the boy and I'll give you the man. And so it makes absolute sense that if you witness violence and it becomes a norm when you are young, that's going to be something that you will indulge in as you grow older. It's a very destructive syndrome.
No, indeed, that's fascinating, and I think we could spend an entire hour-long program just speaking about that. But obviously, we are pushed for time. So let me just bring in Sean now from our team, and she's been monitoring the reaction online on YouTube and Facebook and so on, and just get from her, when she's up on the screen, what the viewers have been saying, and we'll then, if there's any questions from Sean, put them to the panel. Sean, are you there? We can't see you. Have we lost her? She's come. Yeah.
Yes,
You know, Sean. Yeah. What have people been saying?
Okay, so good evening, everybody. Big shout out to all the usual people who have joined us tonight on YouTube and Facebook. Lots of people have been very, very shocked that some of the things that you've spoken about tonight are still going on. They didn't realise that it was still happening. They're giving lots of shout outs to Steve and the other Hunt Sabs. They think you're heroes, and they really admire what you're actually doing. We've had conversations about Shropshire Council have been criticised recently for giving £50,000 to keep the drag hunt going over the COVID crisis. We were talking about the mink cull over in Denmark, the 17 million mink going to be culled because obviously they've not been able to sell the furs during the COVID crisis, which is disgusting. But let's hope that it actually ends the fur trade over there. We also had a conversation about saving battery hens, and that's something that's been my passion in the past. I've saved quite a lot of battery hens, and I think I've got a few people interested in taking on some chickens, which is good. Couple of questions. So Adrienne Davis says Sabs are heroes. Lauren Harper, thanks for fighting, Steve.
Nope.
Diana Isilaris, more of your courage. Thugs who kill sentient beings for fun are psychos who will as happily kill humans as non-human animals. Candy Gregory, police fall into 2 camps, some bizarre behaviours from them at live exports against passive protesters. I think it's been shock, and it's been a real education for people. Peter, I wanted to ask you if you'd seen the recent season of The Crown. And it was something that deeply upset me when I was watching the first few episodes, when they were hunting an injured stag on the moors up in Balmoral. And I just wanted to ask you what your comments were on that. What did you think about that? How do you feel about the royals and the likes of the royals who continue this obsession with hunting, with shooting and killing, and all this blood sports. What are your comments on that?
Well, the royal
That's
family,
particularly interesting, Peter, as well, because the royal family are patrons, are they not, of a range of different animal welfare organisations. So perhaps you could touch on
the Royal Society for the Protection of Animals Against, the RSPCA being one, of course. I think the royal family is such an influential body in our country, and people do, for a variety of reasons, either look up to them or dismiss them, depending on where they're coming from. I think the royal family would do a huge amount of good if they banned all hunting of any kind as far as their family and connections are concerned. It would create a huge influence. Also, particularly as hunting and trophy hunting is something that was initiated as a royal prerogative throughout Africa. They created the whole system, and they are responsible for it. And I think they should take their responsibility seriously now. And I think they should support a ban on all cruelty and all hunting. Interesting. I might just say also, apropos the mink farms in Denmark. Of course, the biggest mink farms are in China and America, surprisingly enough. And as we know, we banned fur farming in the UK in, I think, 2004 because it was deemed to be so cruel. But we have a business in the UK. We import £50 million worth of fur into this country yearly. It is absolutely disgusting, and that should also be banned. Animals should wear their own fur.
Yes, and again, and this is where we need to be putting pressure on so-called representatives in Parliament to actually represent the wishes of the people that elect them. Steve, what's your take on the royal family and the way in which they've been portrayed in The Crown, and the fact that they continue to indulge in blood sports, even though they're patrons of a range of different animal welfare organisations?
Well, I can't say I've seen the latest series of The Crown. I've certainly heard of it, but being patrons of these organisations would seem to me to be massively hypocritical. If you're preaching to one and then going out on a grouse moor and blasting some birds out of the sky for little more than fun, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And again, totally agree with Peter. If they were to abandon all of those blood sports and actually start to, stand up for the organisations that they are patrons of, it would do a massive amount of good.
Ronnie, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I agree with Steve. That's what they should do. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the royal family anyway. I think it's an anachronism. I think it's totally wrong that people should be held up like they are, and I'd like to see the monarchy abolished. But while they do exist, then it's kind of like all celebrities. I think if people are celebrities in any way, and Princess Lewis Hamilton was mentioned earlier, I think they kind of have a duty to set an example, because whether we like it or not, whether they like it or not, people take notice of them, and people are going to follow what they do. And I think it's similar with the royal family, because they're in that position of celebrity. They have a duty to set an example of good behaviour, and going and blasting birds out of the sky and being involved in hunting isn't an example of that. And so they need to, they very much need to change their ways. And it is very strange that we've got the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, Royal Society for Cruelty to Animals, with the word royal, and yet, to a large extent, the royals go against the ethos of those organisations.
Yeah, it's interesting, Steve, as well, isn't it, that the hunting fraternity, the blood sports fraternity, like to portray themselves as conservationists, and yet we know from the pheasant shooting, for example, they import millions and millions of birds. I'd import them that are reared in factory farmed conditions, that we know that the way the grouse moor owners utterly mismanage the moors and are actually contributing to climate change and contributing to flooding because of the mismanagement. It would be far better, would it not, to actually reforest the uplands to stop the grouse shoot, stop the grazing. It's predominantly used for grazing sheep, and I mean that could actually create many more jobs, I would suggest, and help to tackle the extreme weather events. That even if we were to stop putting carbon and methane into the atmosphere from the livestock industry tomorrow, these extreme weather events would continue for a period. And one of the things I think we could do, I would hope any part that would form any part of any kind of meaningful green industrial or green strategy, would be to reforest the uplands. But in terms of shooting, though, Steve, in your experience, I mean, I know that the SABs are now taking on the shoots, and they actually shoot, do they not, far more birds than they actually end up eating, because they have these things called stink pits, don't they, where they shoot them and then they just bury them, do they not? Is that still?
Well, the primary purpose of a stink pit is actually predator control. So these stink pits are run by the keepers of the moors and the shooting estate. So it's not just moors. These will be everything from a small shoot that some farmer has between his mates, right up to the biggest land-owning ones on the moors of Scotland and northern England. The stink pits are basically filled with the carcasses of all of the animals that the keepers have killed and the leftover birds from the shoots to attract the predators. So those stink pits will then be surrounded by snares, which are horrifically cruel, banned in most other EU countries, and traps of all kind of description. So if you spend any kind of time on a grouse moor, it's they'll say that it's conservation and they're maintaining a certain type of environment, but that type of environment would have never existed in how it is. They are heavily managed. They're burning every year. They're burning the peat. They're causing runoff and flooding. These are always byproducts of actually the production of a grouse moor. And like you said, the excess of birds, everything is done on a grouse moor is to produce an excess for people to shoot. The natural balance of grouse in their natural habitat, as in a balanced ecosystem where you've got grouse and the predators, bear in mind, so the predators are suppressed to non-existence, then you wouldn't have those numbers and it wouldn't be economically viable for them to shoot in the first place. But I think there's a big opportunity here, and you only have to look at the Isle of Mull is somewhere where I spend my holidays, and the income they get from ecotourism is massive. It pretty much supports the island, primarily because there's virtually no shooting there, and they call it Eagle Island for a reason. It's got the highest densities of eagles in Europe, and people go there to see them. They go there to see all of the wildlife. Now, there's a huge opportunity here for all of these grouse moor owners to rewild those and turn it over to actually ecotourism, because it will employ a lot more people locally, and wildlife will thrive in those environments. So, there's a huge opportunity there that the shooting brigade are really, really missing.
Absolutely. Sean, any final comments in the last from our viewers? We've only got about a minute left.
Yeah, there's one coming from Kevin Rathbone. Can we revisit the hunting laws, making it fit for purpose?
Well, I think
we could.
I think we'd all agree with that, and I think what we need to do is pressure parliamentarians and political parties to embrace a more sensible piece of legislation. Fortunately, Tony Blair was convinced that banning hunting was a bad idea, when, as Labour leaders often do, of course, was spending his holiday on the yacht of some billionaire, and there was some huntmaster on there who spent the afternoon talking to him about what a bad idea it was to ban hunting, and he then was opposed to it. But obviously it was overwhelmingly supported. A ban was overwhelmingly supported in the House of Commons, and he couldn't prevent it from going through. But of course, the loopholes that they put in are being ruthlessly exploited, as we saw with the opening clip. Listen, we've run out of time. I just want to thank our guests. It's been, it says thanks for watching already. No, we're back. Yeah, no, I just want to thank our guests, Peter, Ronnie, and Steve, for a really fascinating discussion. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it interesting. And if you'd like to get involved with the Hunt Saboteurs Association, then I think the details are or have been on screen. But we will put this video out in the form of a link, and we will give details about how to contact the Hunt Sabs if people are interested in joining up and helping in their activities. So thanks again, as I say, to Peter, Ronnie, and Steve. Next week we'll be on air again at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, when we'll be talking to Ilan Pappy and Jackie Walker about Gavin Williamson's attempt to force universities to adopt the IHRA. So that's it for this evening. Thanks for watching, and good night.